To order videotapes using your Visa or MasterCard, or to receive a free Pacific Arts video catalog, call 1-800-538-5856.
The Mitsubishi A6M, the Zero fighter, won worldwide fame. It was in its own way one of the finest fighters of the war, and in 1941 and 42 was superior to anything the United States could deploy against it. Against a plane as fast and maneuverable as this, a fighter pilot's success depended on a combination of his training, tactics, and personal strengths.
He has to be aggressive. He has to love to fight. He has to love the tank. But he does not, and he cannot do it foolishly. He has to know the performance of his aircraft. It's that simple. You didn't tank with him alone. If you did, you're crazy. And I don't know any fighter pilot that will tell you he fought plane for plane with Zero. And we did have to depend on each other. It was a matter of tactics.
The tactics that allowed the Wildcats to hold the Zeros were a combination of pragmatism and aggression, refined in confrontation with the slippery and dangerous enemy planes.
You can't shoot anything if you can't bring your guns around the barrel. I would ask myself, now what should we do if we're flying along in a formation? Let's say we've got 4 planes, 2 sections, and we saw an enemy. Well, if you think the enemy can outperform you, you don't turn and run, because he can catch you, and you'll be easy target. You turn toward him. Try to keep turning toward him so he can't get on your tail. I wasn't sure how well this would work, so I went out one morning and I got a hold of a young man named Butch O'Hare and gave him 4 airplanes, and I took 4. It really worked.
O'Hare is, in many ways, typical of the Navy pilots. Their work could not simply be a matter of gung-ho aggression. The early Japanese advantages in material and experience had to be answered with a thoughtful attention to tactical development and detail.
He had a way of presenting a problem not only in the air by example, but by quietly explaining it in a little more detail on the ground if needs be. But you got the message rather quickly and in a way that it stuck with you. Little things like maybe conserving fuel, looking over your shoulder at the right time, or at least before making a run or making an attack. And I can safely say that I saved my life a couple of times by remembering little rules like this.
The Zeros had been designed to be as light as possible. They were fast and agile, but their light construction cut both ways. They were also flimsy and unarmored. Unable to compete with the Zero's ability, the fighter pilot had to keep his head and exploit its weakness.
You don't get a chance to make but one mistake. Usually that one mistake is the last one.
The Zero's light construction restricted their dive speed, and they could be severely damaged by very few strikes from the US fighters' guns. By 1943, they had lost their dominance in the face of tougher planes and better tactics. In the weeks following the Battle of the Coral Sea, both sides regrouped and prepared their next move. The Japanese had already decided on their plan to invade Midway, the order having been issued on the 5th of May. As the staff in Hawaii soon became aware, this was to be a massive and elaborate affair involving some 200 ships, including 8 carriers with over 600 aircraft. Admiral Nimitz could only deploy 76 ships in total, and a healthy proportion of these had to be kept in reserve. But by the same token, forewarned and as ready as they could be, the US had no option but to intervene. Hopefully, the Japanese would be sailing into trouble. After Coral Sea, there were only 2 carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, fit for service. But an astonishing effort at the dockyards in Pearl Harbor saw Yorktown repaired in 2 days to sail and join the fleet. Orders flowed on both sides, but the Japanese traffic undermined itself, providing Admiral Nimitz with his major advantage, information. The Japanese plans were complex. 3 groups of ships were involved in an irrelevant invasion of the Aleutian Islands on the 3rd of June, and another 4 in the attack on Midway starting the next day. The carriers were dispersed, with 4 retained as a carrier strike force, and the others split up to escort various convoys and fleets. A picket line of submarines was to wait to intercept the US fleet as it moved to respond. But by the time the picket line took up station, the American ships were already in position north of Midway. The Japanese had made a set of predictions about American response to their attack, which had become the basis for an inflexible and cumbersome battle plan, unable to cope if the Americans didn't do as presumed.
I was called into Admiral Spruance's cabin, and he told me then it could be a turning point because we had very few ships left. So if this was going to be a major battle and we were defeated, well, that meant the end of the war practically.
Early on the 4th, Admiral Nagumo's 4 carriers began trading attacks with land-based planes operating from Midway. To crush this source of trouble, he ordered preparation of a second strike on the island, and his planes were loaded with bombs. Then, reconnaissance sightings of cruisers were dramatically altered to include carriers.
It was 8 o'clock before we actually got a report of the Japanese striking force, which included their carriers. And then it became our time to take off.
While Nagumo was ordering the bombs off his torpedo planes to rearm them and ready an attack, the American strike was already on its way. After constant small attacking groups from Midway had interrupted the morning, the Japanese were uncomfortably stretched. The bomb dodging had left the ships spread out, with over half their planes in the air, either returning from Midway or standing defensive cap. The first wave of American carrier planes became dispersed, and the dive bombers failed to make contact with the Japanese. But at 9:20, 15 slow and obsolete Devastator torpedo planes found them.
We just went into the fleet, tried to get around the destroyers and then the cruisers and things to take whatever came first as a target. They had about 75 airplanes down there trying to eat us up, and we only had 15, so we didn't last very long. I was tail end Charlie, last aircraft in the whole formation, and I was kind of sitting back here watching this whole thing. I made my attack on this carrier, and I somehow got in close enough to drop my torpedo and get through. I couldn't use this hand. I had a bullet in here and one in this arm. The Zeros jumped on me again out on the other side and shot me down. So when I came back to the surface, plumped into my life raft. I'm sitting right in the front row here of this big battle. I saw our dive bombers come in and knew all those boys too, and I knew that this was their first dive, not only with a bomb aboard, but in that airplane. So I was just cheering like a football game.
For an hour, the Zeros fought a defensive battle against 3 waves of torpedo planes, and 35 of 41 attackers fell without any damage to the ships. When at 10:20 the dive bombers arrived, the Zeros were low on ammunition and had been dragged down to sea level. Laid out for the Americans were 4 carriers without fighter cover, and those carriers were halfway through rearming their planes, with bombs and torpedoes scattered on the decks. In less than 5 minutes, 3 carriers were destroyed. Multiple bomb hits sparked chains of explosions that tore them apart. The sole Japanese carrier left now took her turn to attack as, momentarily, the advantage swung. Over 80% of the US planes had either been destroyed or were in the air, low on fuel and heading for home. Hot on the heels of the returning planes came the first attackers. The Japanese planes found Yorktown and attacked her, and the 3 hits they scored left her stopped and burning. Admiral Fletcher transferred his flag to a cruiser while repairs and damage control went on. By 2:30, the Japanese second strike had arrived on the scene. Yorktown, with her fires out and engines turning, was still working up to speed when the attackers arrived. And, thinking she was one of the other carriers and undamaged, they once again devoted their attention to her. Enterprise and Hornet had suffered staggering aircraft losses that morning, and they managed to scrape up only 25 Dauntless dive bombers for an attack on the last Japanese carrier. The attack finally got away at 3:30. At 4, a further 16 planes had been readied, and grimly aware that he was using his last shot, Admiral Spruance sent this force off too. The exhausted Japanese crew were scrambling to prepare a third attack on the carriers, timed for launch at 6 o'clock. But the Americans arrived at 5:30, and the ship was plunged into her last fight. 3 hits sealed her fate. She burnt to the waterline overnight and sank at 9:15 the following morning. Admiral Nagumo's 4 carriers, the heart of Japanese naval strength, had all perished. Yamamoto had only one hope left, that his battleships could intercept the Americans overnight and destroy them. But Spruance, wisely, retired east, and morning saw the Japanese fleet retiring from the scene with the invasion abandoned. The only successful Japanese strikes had both fallen on the Yorktown. The Japanese airmen knew the extent of the damage that they had caused on both occasions, and had therefore assumed the destruction of 2 of the 3 carriers. Yorktown, after the experience in the Coral Sea, had taken all precautions possible, but ran without luck all day. Had the second attack come 10 minutes later, Yorktown would have had another squadron of fighter cover-up, but she was caught virtually undefended and without the speed for evasive maneuvers. She took 2 torpedoes and her fate was sealed. The order was given to abandon ship.
What makes Midway so distinctive, in contrast to the Coral Sea, is that it was a decisive battle. Clearly, this was the beginning of the end of Japanese naval power in the Pacific.
I didn't want them to pick me up, so I put this cushion over my head, and I would turn this sideways to any ship or anything that was close, and I could watch them out of the corner. I'd see through this thing. They were looking at me with binoculars, but they'd see this thing and assume that it was a box or a piece of debris or something rather than my head bobbing up out there, and they passed me up. The PBY came by, landed on the water, and picked me up in this PBY. Took me into Midway. I lost about 24 pounds during that time. When I got down to Pearl Harbor and the Admiral came in, Admiral Nimitz, he said he wanted to know about it. A fisheye view and a front row seat to the biggest naval battle in history. It was something to remember.
The crushing defeat at Midway left the Imperial Navy with fewer carriers in the Pacific than the United States. For the first time, their strategists conceded that the phase of expansion may be coming to a close, but they persisted in their plans to occupy New Guinea and establish bases in the Solomons. American thinking was also focused on these areas as the sites for going onto the offensive. When intelligence reports revealed that the Japanese were building an airbase on the island of Guadalcanal, it was decided to preempt the establishment of a larger garrison there by invading the island. The operation went ahead on the 7th of August 1942 and began the series of battles on and around the island that dragged on to the 4th of January 1943. In that 5 months, the carriers, providing air cover for the landings and the supply and reinforcement convoys, took up an address for the first time, tied to their stations supporting the Marines. The Japanese knew where they were and returned to the attack time and again. A series of naval engagements ensued. In the first of these, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, days after the landings, the small Japanese carrier Ruyo was sunk, and Enterprise was damaged. Then Saratoga and Wasp were both torpedoed by submarines, Saratoga needing repairs and Wasp sinking. While Enterprise was in the dockyard, Hornet remained the only carrier seaworthy. On October the 26th, the two fleets clashed again at Santa Cruz, and Hornet was sunk. Both sides were becoming exhausted, and the Japanese withdrew their carriers. Naval losses were so high that the Imperial Navy advocated abandoning Guadalcanal, but the Army insisted on fighting on, and further small groups of troops were landed. Eventually, even the Army had to accept reality and reluctantly ordered evacuation. For the battered men of the American fleet, it was time to take stock and recover. The whittling away of American naval strength around the battle on Guadalcanal, though severe, would be made up. For the Japanese, the situation was far more critical. Their daily raids on the ships and on the ground forces had been costly. Over 600 planes had been lost in the campaign with their crews. This level of wastage could not be supported, and the overall proficiency of the Japanese aircrew began to suffer. In the United States, training expanded to provide a flow of new pilots. Where the Japanese, to obtain numbers, were accepting lower proficiency in their pilots, the US insisted on comprehensive and relatively leisurely training. The supply of trainers, absolutely necessary but a fairly unglamorous segment of the aviation needs, was typical of the way in which industry supported the war effort. North Americans' excellent Harvards and Texans proliferated. Factories across the land were mass-producing aeroplanes in enormous numbers. Given the way that systems had to be expanded, quality control was astonishingly high, both in design and construction, and many of the planes produced have retained fine reputations. The Navy had entered the war in a state of transition with its aircraft, having only recently deployed monoplanes, and some of its pre-war designs had already shown their inadequacies. However, the gravity of the situation had defined the problems very quickly and very clearly. With specific needs being clarified by battle experience, the response of industry in producing new types in large numbers meant that the Japanese were to lose their advantages in quality and quantity of material very quickly. Where the Grumman Wildcats had been clearly outclassed and had held their own with a combination of guile, discipline and courage, new fighters were on the way to relieve them. The new Grumman plane was the F-6F Hellcat, one of the outstanding aircraft of the war. It was rushed through design and production, but became a major success. Hellcat started to flow from the factory in November 1942. Not only would American aircraft losses be made up more swiftly than the Japanese could replenish, but it was with new and more capable planes, and the numbers would not simply be made up, they would be multiplied. The arrival of new types, like the Hellcat and the equally successful Avengers, which were to be the standard torpedo plane for the rest of the war, brought down the curtain on a phase of the conflict. There was to be a lull in the Pacific action while the combatants recovered. Guadalcanal had shown clearly that the price to be paid in the forthcoming drive on Japan would be high. The theater chiefs, Admiral Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur, would need to be very sparing of casualties if they were to retain strength to push on. Essential to the success or failure of their drive would be air supremacy. The Japanese would have to be driven from the sky. As the Hellcats entered the war, another series of significant arrivals was just commencing. Work had started on the Essex-class carriers in 1939, but meticulous planning and construction had delayed their delivery. Even in 1942, while the fleet lost 4 of its carriers, only 3 Essex hulls were launched. However, as the war went on, the Essexes and the supporting light carriers and escort carriers were to grow in numbers to become the most powerful fleet of all time. By the end of the war, 24 Essex-class carriers had been laid down. These ships came online from December 1942, with 7 being commissioned by the end of the following year. With the new ships came new sailors. The expansion of the Navy had spread its seasoned resources thinly. From the moment the crew came on board a new ship, the shakedown was intense. Each man had to be sure of his duties, practiced and skilled. When they passed through the Panama Canal into the Pacific, there was no time for an extended familiarization. From the dockyard, the ship went fairly directly to the war zone. With over 3,400 men on board, each ship was a not insignificant little town. On board were the specialist services of a town: butchers, plumbers, bakers, doctors and carpenters and so on. The flyers were, of course, the striking arm of the ship, and considerable glamour attached to them. The Essex class carried between 80 and 100 planes, and this strength relied on the multitude of specialists running the ship and her defenses and maintaining and arming the planes. There was little leisure time on the cruise to the war. A Navy pilot once remarked that the ship looks like a matchstick in a swimming pool when you're coming into land. The Essex carriers were very big as ships, but as airfields, their flight decks were tiny. The management of the limited space on a carrier is one of the most significant, complex, and continuous activities on board. Space, or rather the lack of it, is critical. Into this small and crowded airfield returned planes that were often damaged, limping home with their crew, sometimes unable to land, just crash. Where land bases were surrounded by wrecks that were picked over for parts by mechanics, there was no room for such luxury on a ship. If a plane was badly damaged, that was it. If available, another would be lifted out of the hold and assembled. But in any case, a wrecked plane was only a waste of space. Though crew losses remained surprisingly light for much of the war, attrition of planes was another matter. While the US Navy repeatedly extended itself to minimize casualties, the demands for new crew, to man new ships, and to relieve and replace the men in the front line saw over 30,000 Navy pilots in training by the end of 1942. The Japanese Navy, in contrast, reached its peak of strength with 3,500 experienced flyers in 1941 and was unable to match either the numbers or the quality of the American pilots. Life for the deck crew was irregularly punctuated with moments of high drama and danger. A phosphorus fire in a bomb strapped to a plane, for example. The special cases produced by combat were added to the normal numbers of accidents. Planes overrunning or missing the wires and ending up in the barrier, or a plane getting a blowout on landing. All the crew could do was ensure that the plane was in the best possible condition when the pilot got into it, that the guns would work, that the bombs were safely stowed, that the engine would run sweetly, that the plane was clean to extract the last edge of speed that might make a critical difference. And if he could get it back to the ship in any condition, then the crew would do anything possible to ensure he got out safely. The pilots understood their reliance on the shipboard specialists in very simple terms. Every time he took off, the pilot put his life in their hands.
The enlisted man, whether he's the man in your squadron or whether he's a shipboard deck handler, the man that unhooks your tail hook, the man that catapults you, or the man that moves you between planes. I trusted the man that put that aircraft under me, and I think that's a supreme compliment you can pay somebody.
My plane captain was 19 years old, 18 years old, Sammy Belt in the Essex. And I just have to ask him, is the plane ready to fly?
Wartime experience was underlining the importance of the aircraft carrier, but was also demonstrating that the powerful attack carrier was either wasted or inappropriate in many situations where some sort of carrier was needed. Different demands were being made for a great number of carriers, but clearly it would not be necessary or affordable to build a huge fleet of Essex-class ships. One need was that of fast fleet defense. What was needed here was a ship with the speed of an attack carrier, but needing only to carry fighters. Cruiser hulls were selected for conversion, but not the huge battle cruisers that had become Saratoga and Lexington. Flimsy speedsters, Cleveland-class light cruiser hulls, were transformed into what became the Independence-class carriers. With an aerial complement of 45 planes and a speed of 31 knots, they provided a strong protective umbrella for the battle fleet and the big carriers, who were able to send off their own fighters to cover the attack planes. Compared to the 27,000-ton Essex ships, the Independence displaced only 11,000 tons. They did serve well in their niche. All 9 were commissioned in 1943, and they served for many years, the last US ship being withdrawn from service in 1970. Carriers were also needed in great numbers for a range of humbler but no less critical roles. Remote islands needed new planes delivered. Assault craft ferrying men to the beach needed to be kept free of air attack. Convoys needed fighter protection against submarines and long-range bombers. Obviously, a carrier plodding along with a convoy did not need to be able to do 30 knots or deploy 100 planes. But equally as obvious, there were a lot of convoys.
For one long period, we were losing over 500,000 tons of ships per month. Altogether, we lost several thousand ships. The shore-based airplanes we had early in the war were not long enough range to reach all the way across the Atlantic. And so there was a so-called mid-ocean gap. Our CVEs came along and closed that gap up. When they did, the CVEs really made a shambles of the Sub Fleet.
In the course of the war, the United States Navy commissioned over 80 escort carriers. More were built for the British and other navies. Despite being known as baby flat tops or jeep carriers, these ships made an immense contribution wherever they were deployed. The first were converted merchantmen, but soon hulls were being laid down as escort carriers, still basically built to freighter designs, but urgently needed to carry planes. There were 7 different classes of U.S. escort carriers, but all tended to be around 8,000 tons, restricted to under 20 knots in speed, and deploying around 30 aircraft. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the 2 carriers based there were both engaged in one type of activity, ferrying planes. Lexington was over 1,200 miles away, delivering dive bombers to the Marines on Midway, and Enterprise was returning from a similar mission to take 12 Wildcats to Wake. These ferrying missions had the fortuitous effect of keeping the carriers from the cauldron of Pearl Harbor. But from the moment war started, any use of a fleet carrier as an aeroplane transport was a waste of all that ship's power. The escort carriers in the Pacific spent a lot of time carting aircraft to various islands. The distances involved were way outside the range of most of the planes, and the only ways to shorten those distances were to move the airfield nearer, use a carrier, or disassemble the plane, put it on a ship to be reassembled before use. The latter was, of course, impractical in a battlefield, and the arrival of functioning planes under their own power was far preferable. Here, as the convoys prepare to set sail for the invasion of the Marianas, squadrons of Air Force P-47 Thunderbolts are loaded onto 2 of the Casablanca-class carriers. The invasion of Saipan would see some of the bloodiest fighting of the war, dragging on over 3 weeks to secure an island of only 72 square miles. The air cover and air support for the troops would have to be initially provided by the fleet carriers. But to tie them to a beachhead not only robbed them of their lethal maneuverability in attack, it also made them relatively static targets. It was essential that planes be deployed from the island air bases as soon as possible after the invasion, which is where the P-47s on the 2 escort carriers came in. They were to be flown to Saipan as soon as the airfield there could be captured and ready for use, and by doing so, release the fleet carriers to go about more appropriate duties. In later invasions, massed escort carriers would provide the air cover for the beachhead themselves. The expansion of American carrier strength is startling. In 1941, the fleet boasted a strength of 7 carriers, 6 fleet carriers, and 1 fairly experimental escort carrier. 3 years later, in 1944, the fleet composed 13 fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light fleet carriers, and 63 escort carriers. The total of 85 carriers does not reflect a strength of 85 Essex-class carriers. However, the presence of the escort carriers does mean that the 22 fast fleet carriers could all be available to act in attacking formations. The situation otherwise would have seen the power of the fleet divided into active and passive roles. The escort carriers had the effect of multiplying the force available for offensive action, cheaply and very quickly. The escort carriers were basically unarmored, built up on standard hulls. They were also slow. When the kamikazes entered the conflict, they often were attracted by these slow-moving, less defended and flimsily constructed ships. The little carriers suffered badly when hit. No Essex-class ship was to be sunk during the war, though some received terrible damage. For their tiny relatives, things went far harder. One theatre that the escort carriers came to dominate was the Atlantic, where they became a key player in the war against the German Navy's submarine force. In a battle that was fought as hard and as closely as any engagement of the conflict, the fighting in the Atlantic seesawed over the course of the war, with the U-boats seeming to have gained the upper hand for several periods. The introduction of the escort carriers had immediately served to curtail the activity of the long-range Luftwaffe Condors, which had been attacking convoys well out of the range of protective fighters based in the British Isles. The Condors had been very effective in their bombing and strafing attacks and had supplemented the work of the German main card, the subs. The overcoming of the submarines was to take considerably longer. As the escort carriers first came onto the scene, they operated, as their name implies, escorting convoys, physically trudging across the ocean in company with the mass of freighters, keeping an umbrella of air power open. In this passive role, they suppressed the activity of the long-range bombers very effectively, and did cause major difficulties for the subs, which were forced to spend a lot more time submerged. At that time, the major offense against the submarines was being taken up by hunter-killer groups of destroyers and frigates. Later, as their numbers multiplied, the escort carriers became the core of a new kind of hunter-killer group, a circle of destroyers acting in concert with a baby flat top. The combination of planes with the fast and deadly destroyers was to be the final straw for the submarine offensive. Now, no matter where they were deployed to, in wolf packs or alone, they were constantly subject to interruption and attack from the air. And when the carrier planes appeared, the U-boat crew knew that the destroyers were not far away. In the right conditions, the thin, distinctive shape of the submarine could be seen easily from the air, up to a depth of 60 feet, and the subs began to spend less and less time near the surface. Given the huge difference in the speed of a U-boat on the surface as opposed to one submerged, the carriers, even when they didn't find and sink them, were radically curtailing their mobility and effectiveness. The Casablanca-class carrier Guadalcanal was at the center of a hunter-killer group that pulled off one of the most romantic escapades of the war during a patrol in the Atlantic in May 1944. The group made contact with a submarine, and, with the aircraft keeping it under visual surveillance, the destroyers proceeded to give it a hammering with depth charges. When the submarine surfaced, the American ships had opened fire only with their lighter guns. But there was no intention to fight left with the German crew. They opened the scuttles to sink their boat and took to the sea. The Americans had already launched boarding parties, and they took possession of the submarine in time to shut the seacocks and stop her from sinking. However, they were unable to operate the ship's pumps to clear the water out, and U-505 remained full of water and very near to going down. U-505 wallowed uncomfortably in the Atlantic swell as more men from the carrier boarded her. Having captured a submarine, the last thing they wanted was to have it sink on them. But it was to prove a difficult matter to bring the reluctant sub under control. While this effort to save their U-boat was going on, the German crew were picked up by other ships in the group. In the critical months of the Battle of the Atlantic, the few available escort carriers had been tied to the convoys. But as their numbers had allowed their release to active anti-sub patrol rather than convoy defense, their success was striking. In the 12 months from May 1943, their planes sank 43 submarines, a very valuable contribution in itself. But more importantly, with their ferocious supplement to the long-range liberators, the Battle of the Atlantic had been won. Where the fleet carriers were to remain in commission for many years after the end of the war, most of the escort carriers were discarded at war's end. Some of the most basic carriers had simply been decked merchantmen, deploying only 4 planes and still travelling with holds full of cargo. These could easily be returned to more conventional configuration and resume their merchant activity. Many of the purpose-built carriers required more refitting than they were worth in the post-war glut of shipping. Most disappeared almost as fast as they had arrived. Guadalcanal, the carrier which captured the U-boat, was scrapped in 1956, a fate which her prize eluded. The submarine is preserved and displayed at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. Though it was a near-run thing, U-505 had been taken under tow by the carrier and had been dragged along behind as the ship steamed to a rendezvous with an ocean-going tug, still flying off her anti-submarine patrols. Guadalcanal's coup in capturing U-505 and taking it under control as a prize of war is a footnote in history, almost a sideshow. Much of the work of the little carriers was like that. Beside the radiant deeds of the task groups which fought epic battles over hundreds of miles of ocean, they were nearly invisible. Despite the lack of glamour attaching to the escort carriers, their contribution was enormous. The work they did was essential, and the work they did was very well done.